Okay, so back again with another vlog on chapter 10. Here I'm going to go on into some other questions of Christology. If we've dealt with the question of how the Son is related to the Father, and I don't think we've entirely resolved that, but we've come up with some language that at least you have to say in order to agree with the councils. There's also another question, which is what's the relationship between the Son and the humanness of Jesus? So if the Son has pre-existed, has been around for all time, and exists before Jesus does in some sense, or maybe exists eternally, right? If we go back to God outside of time, I don't know what any of this means in particular language. We'd have to sort that out. What are we going to do with the divine and human in Jesus? So is Jesus has a divine mind but a human body? Is Jesus, does he have like parts of him, or his emotions human but his rationality is divine? What's his decision-making process, right? Does he have a divine will or a human will or both wills? What about his knowledge? Is his knowledge divine because the divine is supposed to be all-knowing? Is Jesus all-knowing, or does he have human knowledge? Or does he have two sets of knowledges inside of him? And at this point, how can we hold on? Is Jesus one person? Or is Jesus like multiple persons? Does Jesus have multiple personalities that can kind of switch off? Is he like a Jekyll Hyde type thing? These are all kind of questions that come up in the process as early Christians try and sort this out, maybe in more detail than they should have, but they try and figure all this out, and they try and come up with positions that will eventually define orthodoxy in Christianity. So what do I want to do? So first of all, let me suggest an option that was eventually thrown out, but is interesting and still is, I think, a way that some Christians think about this, which is the position of Apollinaris of Laodicea. That's a fancy name. So Apollinaris of Laodicea is actually fairly late. He's in the 390s. So he is, he's aware the Council of Nicaea is about that time. He knows things that are going on. But he articulates the theory that Jesus is a divine person with a divine nature, right? But basically a human body. So he does make that distinction that Jesus has a divine soul, but a human body. And this allows Apollinaris to make a set of distinctions that keep this fairly clean. So when Jesus suffers, for instance, it's Jesus's body that suffers. It is the human part of Jesus, the flesh, that suffers. When there is emotion, it's the flesh that feels emotion. It's not the divine that feels the emotion, right? And this allows him, going back to some of those Greek categories, to set up a set of distinctions. So certainly the divine was in Jesus, right? Just as a soul is in a body. But there's also a kind of break in between these, between the human and the divine, that allows him to keep a distinction that keeps the divine pure and perfect and separate from. So if there's ever ignorance, that's a matter of the human, right? Whereas the divine retains perfect knowledge the entire time. And I do think that some Christians continue to think about Jesus kind of in this way, that they divide out between a divine soul and a human body, although maybe not as consistently as comes about with Apollinaris. But this is an early position that bounces around during the patristic period, but eventually Christianity, at least in terms of orthodoxy, doesn't go with this. as being the solution that they take. So one possible way of doing things, we can see why it was that an early Christian came up with this option, but eventually rejected as heretical. Now, again, as is almost always the case, we come up with a set of options that appear to take two different possibilities, and then a kind of solution that's come to with the council that articulates a kind of creedal statement that people have to agree with, that doesn't entirely resolve the issue, although comes up with some technical language to sort it out in some way. So there are two different schools of approach to humanity and divinity in Jesus. And these two different schools are the Alexandrian school and the Antiochian school, which goes along with Alexandria down in Egypt, and Antioch, which is north of Jerusalem. There are two major centers of early Christianity. And we've already come across these two schools because they had very different ways of reading the scriptures. Not very different ways, but qualifiedly different ways. The Antiochian school with Theodore of Mopsuestia took a more historical critical, a little bit more literalistic reading, what we might think of as a literalistic reading, although that doesn't really fit. I mean, they definitely are into typology and other things like that, but they're more historical than the Alexandrian school. So the Alexandrian school is more reading the scripture in terms of allegory and metaphor and all of that. But they also divide on several other issues, including issues of soteriology. If you remember soteriology, soteriology is the study of salvation, and how Jesus brings about the salvation of humanity through the incarnation, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So in Alexandria, there forms what can be called an assumption soteriology, or an assumption theory of atonement, which is basically like, so God is the divine, the eternal. God has all of these perfect qualities, right? And what God wants to do is to take the human, which doesn't automatically have all of those qualities, which couldn't have had all of those qualities, because it's not God. So only God has all of the eternal qualities, all of the perfect qualities. And since God made human beings, and they are not of the same substance as God, the human must be transformed if it's going to participate in divinity. If humans are going to have eternal life, if humans are going to live in eternal relationships of love with God, the human must be transformed so that it can be eternal, right? And how do you transform the human? But you have to put it in contact with the divine. The human has to be assumed by the divine. And here you can kind of think about, imagine that I have two sponges, right? And one of them is filled with like water that has a kind of it has red food coloring in it, right? And the other one just has plain water in it. And I want to take the quality of the food color water, and I want to make the other sponge have that quality too. How could I give the one sponge together? Well, I would put them in contact with each other. And I would have the one sponge with the food colored water, the red food colored water, right? I'd squeeze them together so that some of that water moved into the other sponge, the sponge without the food colored water, so that they both took on the same quality of having food colored water. If that makes any sense. I'm trying here, this is a metaphor. That's what needs to happen with the divine, which is the sponge with the food-colored water, and the human, which is the sponge without the food-colored water. Basically, the divine needs to come in and overtake the human, right? Now they've got to have a kind of point of contact between them, but basically the divine has to come in and overtake the human so that the human is subsumed under the divine, so that the human is able to take on divine characteristics. In order to allow human beings to become eternal, human beings must be transformed by the eternal. And this means that the divine has to take on the human in all of its different varieties. This is why, in part, the divine has to be born as a human being so that the baby human is saved and grows up through middle age and has to go all the way through the death of humanity in order to transform this humanity. So the emphasis is that there has to be a unity of the divine and the human in order to bring this about. You have to really bring these two together so that their unity, the unity of the divine and the human in Jesus, is effective in order to get to salvation, right? And so the implication is that a lot of Alexandrian theologians push the unity of the divine and the human in Jesus, and push for the idea that the human is subsumed by the divinity of Jesus, that there is, as they would emphasize, one hypostasis that is Jesus, because the Son really becomes flesh in Jesus. And so the unity of the divine and the human in Jesus is really significant to the Alexandrian school. Now, the Antiochian school takes a different approach to soteriology and thus takes a different approach to Christology, the relation of the divine and the human in Jesus, right? So they take on an obedience soteriology. And the idea here is that part of the problem with Christianity, with the human, is that the human has failed in being obedient to the divine. All the way back to Adam and Eve, the problem here is that Adam and Eve did not follow the commands of God. They took the apple from the tree and they ate it. And we have continually, as human beings, fallen away from obedience to God. So what's needed in order to bring about salvation is a change in that relationship between the human and the divine, a change in the relationship between the human and the divine so that the human is obedient to the divine. But this means that you can't just collapse the human and the divine, because if you collapse the human and the divine, if you say, well, Jesus just is human and divine, right, then there's not enough human to be obedient to the divine. You have to have a separation between the two so that the human is able to hear the order and comply with the order of the divine, right? There's got to be enough independence of the human from the divine that in Jesus, when Jesus is obedient, it's not just the divine being obedient to the divine, but it's the human in Jesus being obedient to the divine in Jesus. So that Jesus has actual choices that Jesus makes as a human being. Am I going to go along with the divine will, even internal to myself? And salvation is brought about by Jesus consistently being obedient. As Paul says at one point, being obedient even to the point of death, right? That the human in Jesus is obedient to the divine, even to the point of accepting death on the cross. And that's not a significant thing if Jesus just is the divine subsumed, or the human subsumed by the divine. What you need is a little bit more separation between those two in order to get an obedience picture of salvation, right? And so in the Antiochian school of Christology, there was a kind of emphasis on the separation of the two. And theologians like Theodore of Mopsuestia really significant and really, I mean, just an excellent. If you ever read his stuff, he's incredibly. He's a brilliant theologian. Theodore of Mopsuestia will say, yeah, so the human is overtaken by the divine in something more than the way that, so the Holy Spirit falls upon the human in something more than the way that it fell on the prophets. And it's really significant how the Holy Spirit and the divine overtakes the human, but there must also be a separation between the human and the divine. We can't just subsume it into the divine. We can't lose the human into the divine. And that this form of theology reaches its kind of fullest statement in maybe Nestorius, the work of Nestorius, another early Christian, who says, yeah, actually what happens here is we've all agreed that the divine is one ousios, one substance, and three or multiple persons, right? So the Son is one person. What happens is the Son comes down and ends up joining with another person. So you have the divine person, the Son, and you have the human person of Jesus that are put together in Jesus. There are two persons in Jesus, right? And this was something that the Alexandrians couldn't accept. They said, no, the person, the human needs to be subsumed so that there's really only one person in Jesus. The person of the Son has to overtake the human so that they are joined into a single person, because that's the only way that our theory of salvation can work out, is if the human is subsumed and they become one person. And Nestorius says, no, because if we collapse the two into one person, then there won't be a human person to be obedient to the divine person. Now, eventually, the Nestorians are ruled out of bounds, and in some sense, the Cyril of Alexandria's solution also isn't adopted in full. That solution that said we're just gonna have just the one person and that's it. Theodore of Mopsuestia, kind of really unfortunately, I think it's kind of a screwy deal, that Theodore of Mopsuestia becomes one of the first people to be declared a heretic and anathematized, basically kind of kicked out of the church after he dies. During his entire life, Theodore of Mopsuestia was basically an Orthodox theologian, but it's after he dies that they go back and they say, well, you know what, this teaching wasn't Orthodox, and so we're going to say that he was a heretic and kick him out of the church. It's just kind of cruel. I mean, he didn't know what the next council was going to find. Nestorius, it's much more at the time of Nestorius that they have this argument. And Nestorius's version of Christianity eventually is anathematized, treated as something beyond orthodox. Although, again, as with Arius, the Nestorian version of Christianity goes on for a long time and continues off. And you'll find, even in China, you find Nestorian versions of Christianity. This claim that there were like two persons that were in Jesus, the one divine and the one human, continues on for hundreds of years after this, but eventually loses the claim to be kind of orthodox in the sense that the councils agree to it. What happens is there's another council, the Council of Chalcedon, that comes out with a couple of different claims. So one is the Caledonian definition. The Caledonian definition is that Jesus was fully divine and fully human. You have to be able to say that in order to be a Christian. And this kind of leans towards the Alexandrian solution. So you can't say, well, I guess it kind of splits the difference, right? Because it's fully human and fully divine. But what it does is it adopts the language of there's one person in Jesus, right? So there's a human and divine person in Jesus. But that person has two natures, two physis. Remember I said that the language of physis was going to become important. So Jesus is one person, divine and human, with two natures, the divine nature and the human nature. And so again, they're kind of figuring out how can we say a little bit of both of these schools. The one person who is divine and human, who is Jesus, the Son, and the two natures, which are the divine nature and the human nature, right? And so they're trying to balance out between these, and this is the solution that they come to. It's not clear that it actually gives either side exactly what they want. We can't say with Nestorius that there's two people in Jesus, one divine and one human. We can't say with Cyril of Alexandria that there's just one person and that's all we want to go with. We have to say that there's one person and two natures, the divine nature and the human nature. We also say that there's no part of Jesus that is separated out. So we can't say with Apollinaris, it's not like Jesus has a human body and a divine spirit. Jesus' body is in fact a divine body, right? And this pushes against that Greek philosophical system that had said that you can't have divine flesh, a divine body, right? Christianity actually says at the Council of Chalcedon that no. The human body it can be divine. And in Jesus was divine, which is an important move. And in part, it ties into the doctrine of the sacraments. So when Christians go and they get communion, right, they take into themselves the body of Jesus. And the body of Jesus, according to this doctrine, is divine body. So if you think about it, if I leave a piece of meat out, right, the meat will disintegrate. And if I eat a regular piece of meat, it'll serve me for a while, but then I'll get hungry again. But Jesus's body is eternal body. It is doesn't fall apart. So if you take into yourself the eternal body of Jesus, then it is sustaining. It is eternal. It transforms you into something eternal by participating in that, because Jesus' body is in fact divine. So we can't divide out between Jesus' soul and Jesus' body, one of them being divine, one of them not being divine. Jesus is fully divine. Jesus is fully human. Jesus is one person, and Jesus has two natures, the human nature and the divine nature. Now, I will note that there's another significant branch of Christianity that breaks off over exactly this question, the natures of Jesus. So Coptic Christianity, a kind of Christianity that breaks off in Egypt, in Ethiopia, in a lot of these kind of ancient, at this point, I mean, they're ancient churches to us, and they exist from as far back as the Council of Chalcedon. They come to a disagreement about this language, and they want to say that there is one person in Jesus, and there's one nature in Jesus, but that nature is both divine and human. Right? So as opposed to what eventually becomes the Council of Chalcedon Orthodox answer to this, there are significant parts of Christianity that still exist today that go on and develop a different answer to that question, and they're still having arguments about exactly what it is that they disagree on. What does it mean to claim the difference between a human nature and a divine nature in Jesus, as opposed to claiming that there's one nature that is human and divine? And if at this point you start to get frustrated with this, it makes a lot of sense. In contemporary Christianity, I'll say something about that in a minute. There are further arguments that continue to go about Christology. So, for instance, the argument about whether Jesus has one will or two wills. And eventually the conclusion is that Jesus does in fact have two wills, which was important to that Antiochian school of Christianity, that there is a divine will that always gets things right, of course, and there's a human will that is always obedient to the divine will. So that becomes a kind of official answer about that. At least if you're following the Orthodox tradition, being the councils and the creeds. There's a lot of further thought on whether Jesus has one or two knowledges, because there's clearly times in the gospel where Jesus appears not to know what is going on or what's going to happen, not the least the Garden of Gethsemane. The Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prays, and he prays apparently to the Father, right? He kind of sees that the crucifixion is coming, and he says, if you could take this cup away from me, if there's any other way to do this, I would love not to get crucified, right? And so he prays this, but that seems to suggest that, at least in his position as Jesus, that he doesn't know that this is for sure or that this is going to happen. Is that a statement about God's knowledge, that God doesn't always know the future? Is it a statement about a difference between the divine knowledge and the human knowledge in Jesus? There are theologians that have articulated answers to that, but there's no one answer that eventually gets a kind of council to agree with it. There's a schism between Eastern Orthodoxy and the Western Roman Catholic Church, which splits off over questions of ecclesiology, questions of the place of the Pope, and whether you need a council in order to come to canonical decisions before that gets resolved in any council, if it would have gotten resolved in any council had that not happened. So there's a continuing area of theology. Now, I do want to come back to the question of what happens if you're looking at all this and you say, you know what, I think that they're claiming more than they could actually know about Jesus, or maybe we've stepped too far into Greek like philosophical categories of substance and nature and person and all of that. Well, there's places for you too, especially in modern and some forms of postmodern theology. There were a group of people, there are a group of theologians that say, this is, you know what, we've really gone too far into all of these technicalities in talking about Jesus. And what we really wanted to know was, is Jesus the thing that facilitates our relationship with God? Is the story of Jesus what brings us into contact with God? Does Jesus reveal God? Is Jesus the revelation of God in the world? Is Jesus what allows us to see God, right, in a way? And there's a lot of theologians that turn into that direction. And instead of focusing on these Greek categories, instead focus on gaining your relationship with God through Jesus. So emphasizing Jesus as mediator, emphasizing Jesus as that which brings us back into relationship with God through the revelation of God's love on the cross. Doing a lot of that. So there are theologians who kind of step away from these classical categories and find them to be inadequate or maybe overstatements of what the church could know. There's other theologians today who very much are going back to Orthodox language in order to try and talk about Jesus, or maybe in order to try not to talk about Jesus. There's an apophatic way of reading this entire tradition that says, you know what we've done is basically we've come up with a bunch of categories that we don't know what they mean. All they do is they rule out particular options in Christianity. So we've said we can't be Arians. We've said we can't be Nestorians. But we haven't really said much about exactly what we mean by any of the technical terms that we've put forward. So maybe what all of this technical language is to do is to keep us from saying too much about God. When I say Jesus is one person, two natures, right, what I'm really saying is I'm not sure exactly how all this works out. And maybe that's part of what Christian theology, if you're in the apophatic tradition, not liking positive language about God, maybe that's what you're doing with Christological formulas. You can go in so many different directions from this. What else? There's probably one other thing I should say something about, which is the relationship of the historical Jesus. And I'm going over this modern stuff much quicker. You can find lots more about it, obviously, in your reading. Okay, so what do I want to say about the historical Jesus? Really quickly, there's a modern argument which makes sense coming out of the Reformation. The Reformation said it was going to peel back, get rid of church tradition, and get back to the Bible, right? And after that, it makes sense to say, well, the Bible has its own traditions that are built up in it. Maybe what we need to do is even ask questions about what's behind the Bible. Like, who was this guy? Use our critical historical knowledge to develop accounts of who Jesus was, looking at the Gospels as sources, but then looking also at the context in which it was in, the historical context of Pharisees, Sadducees, the Zealots in the first century, looking at all that, right? Let's peel back the tradition that is in the Bible and let's go to the historical figure of Jesus, because that really gets us back to the ultimate source of Christianity, which is with Jesus. So that is the basis of the move to the historical Jesus. And I think you find lots of different positions. I'll give you three different basic positions here. One is the kind of idea that we ought now to base our theology upon the historical Jesus. And some people do that, especially people who are historical Jesus scholars. Makes sense for them to develop their theologies on the basis of that. So one is John Dominic Crossan, who is a contemporary biblical scholar and theologian of kinds. He makes a lot of claims that would be rejected by most Christians, but he produces this historical theory of Jesus as a kind of wise person who is in conflict with the Roman Empire primarily as an anti-imperial teacher and a person who's pushing against the abuses of power that come with the Roman Empire. And so he thinks that this is where we ought to start theology, is that Christians ought to be anti-imperial, against great worldly power. And that means today, like, being incredibly critical of the United States and the way the United States uses power in the world, because Jesus was an anti-imperial teacher. We have to look for what's empire in our own time. And so he develops a theory off of that. Others develop other theories. There are a lot of people who've done work on the relationship of Jesus and Judaism, the Judaism of his own day, and interpreting Jesus as a Jewish teacher and seeing what it means if you read Jesus and in that context. What does it tell us about Jesus? Now, that is a significant area of interest today, and there are a lot of theologians and people in churches who really love the historical Jesus books, and that makes sense, especially in the post-Reformation period. One of the dangers that a lot of people think, with the emphasis on historical Jesus and founding your theology on the historical Jesus, is that it might be that theology has to change all the time depending on what historical theory is put forward. It turns out that a lot of historical Jesus work is kind of speculative. We're kind of guessing at who Jesus was in particular historical contexts and trying to get as good a knowledge of the historical context as we can. But that changes all the time. John Dominic Crossan's picture of Jesus is not the same as James Dunn's picture of the historical Jesus. They're very different, and they're even more different from what other scholars have done. And so does this mean that theology is too open to shifting around if you base it on historical theories and theories of the historical Jesus? Was there some point to focusing on the Christian tradition and what that gave you in terms of claims about Jesus? The idea that we've actually developed an account of the Trinity, right? You don't get that if you start with the historical Jesus. Unless you build it in the beginning of your starting point, you don't get that, because the Trinity develops as a theory later on in Christianity. It's not in the Bible. It's not something. If we go back to look at the historical Jesus, that's not terminology that existed at the time in the historical context. So you're not going to get a developed picture of the Trinity if you go with a theology grounded on the historical Jesus. Now, some theologians have gone very much in the opposite direction. So some of those theologians are modern theologians who have asked questions about whether the historical tradition has gone too far into the Greek terminology and kind of lost what Jesus was doing in the first place, which is to create a kind of relationship with us, and to say that Jesus is the appearance of God, the revelation of God. Jesus is what mediates our relationship with God. Jesus is the appearance of God to me, right? And that, as a Christian, is actually what's more important to me than did Jesus have two physis with one hypostasis, or does Jesus have is Jesus is the Son a hypostasis of the Father, or whatever else. Like, there's some theologians who say that just went off the rails in classical. What we really want is the relationship with God that is mediated through the story of Jesus that we get. And you can have some theologians like Paul Tillich, who would go so far as to say that the Jesus that they know is the Jesus of their faith. It is the Jesus of this story. It is the Jesus that strikes them and brings about this relationship. It's the Jesus that touches them as they worship. It is the Jesus that fills them with awe when they think about the love of the cross. It is the Jesus that is the Jesus of this story. But they say, look, at that point, they say, look, I've experienced that Jesus. I have a relationship with that Jesus. I don't have any relationship with the Jesus of history. I don't even know who that is, this historically theorized figure that you put forward. And Tillich will, press this incredibly far to say, you know what, if you could show me, if a historian would come and show me the bones of Jesus, show me that the historical Jesus was not resurrected, right? That he died and that his followers hid him in a cave someplace, and then that you can still find his bones. He said that would not shake my faith, because that's not the Jesus. I know I've encountered Jesus through the narrative, the Jesus who reveals God to me. So even if it was the story of the historical Jesus that produced that, right? The thing that was produced in the process of that narrative, the thing that I've experienced in church, is the true Jesus of my faith. And so I don't need the historical Jesus anymore. If you showed me that the historical Jesus didn't exist, it wouldn't affect my faith at all. Because what I have faith in is the Jesus that I have encountered, and that shapes my view of the world now. And I couldn't give that up. I can't give that up, no matter what historians find. And so there's one group that wants to ground theology on historical Jesus, there's another group that says, you know what, not only the Greek categories were too technical, and the historical Jesus stuff is too speculative, and really what we're looking for is our experience that we've had of Jesus and of God, and that's the basis for our theology. And so their Christology is then based on this kind of experience of Christ. Then there's a lot of theologians who occupy a kind of middle ground in relation to the historical Jesus, who say, you know what, the historical Jesus stuff is interesting. We ought to pay attention to it. It's something that can inform our theology, but it's not something that's the ground of our theology. A lot of Christians don't want to go all the way to Tillich, want to say, no, you know what, historical things are relevant to my faith. I think if Jesus wasn't resurrected as a historical matter, right, I can't go all the way to Tillich there. I think the history is important, is tied into my faith, right? I can't separate it out. But I also don't think that we should ground our theology on historical speculation. There's a lot of traditional Christians who just want to say, you know what, I go with the basic claims. Jesus is the person of God, a part of the Trinity, and I'm going to base my theology on that, out of that Orthodox tradition of understanding Jesus. And so I don't ground it in the historical Jesus. As a matter of fact, I understand the historical Jesus from the perspective of my tradition and my theological claims, right? So you can kind of turn it in a direction like that. There's lots of different ways you can go in Christian theology, and of course, lots of arguments about it, and lots of arguments about what's truly Christian. But that shouldn't surprise you at this point. That's pretty much what theology is all about. Okay, well, I'll come back. There's so much more we could say about Christology, but I'm going to have to call it quits for my discussion of it today. Thank you very much.